We spent a long time now talking about glucose metabolism, whether it's glycolysis, citric acid cycle, or electron transport system. You'd think that biologists own stock in a sugar company. But sugar is not the only thing that we use to make energy, right? You get calories from fats and proteins as well. And we can use the same apparatus, all those same chemical reaction suites, in order to extract energy and make ATP from those as well. So let's take a look at those here. So in each of the slides I'll provide a little more detail, but we can really break this down into our three main chemical reaction systems. And obviously the earlier that I can introduce a molecule, then the more chance there is for energy extraction and the more ATP we make. General principle there. Well, we know that glucose enters in here, but what about starch, glycogen, and other things we can digest that are carbohydrates? Let's take a quick look at those. Well, here's our overall layout again. We'll start with glycolysis, and then citric acid cycle, and then finally electron transport system. We're really only going to be dabbling in the green and the blue areas because those are the ones that chop up organic molecules. So we can't digest cellulose, but amylose, or good old starch. There are a couple different forms of that. And glycogen, both of those are all composed of glucose monomers. And all we have to do is split those apart, feed glucose right into the system. And it's the same as everything else we've been studying so far. What about fats or lipids? We know that they have calories, a lot of calories. They have more calories gram for gram than either proteins or carbohydrates. We'll find out why in a minute. What do we do with them? Well, the glycerol part that holds the triglyceride together can actually go into glycolysis, but most of the rest of it goes in pretty early in the citric acid cycle, which means we have to have oxygen. Since this takes place in the mitochondria, then we need oxygen for any of these to work. So let's take a closer look at that on the screen. For lipids, let's use this triglyceride as an example. It's a big molecule, and we know it has a lot of energy. So that part of it, the glycerol portion, can be fed kind of partway through glycolysis. It's a 3-carbon molecule, so that kind of makes sense. The rest of it, which is the biggest part, gets chopped up into these 2-carbon pieces and fed in as acetyl-CoA, this important molecule right here that enters the citric acid cycle at the beginning. The process of breaking down these fatty acid chains into these 2-carbon bits is known as beta oxidation. So we keep doing that. This also gives us some NADH, which we can then use to drive the electron transport system. So that's why lipids give us so much energy. What about proteins? We know we can use those for energy as well. We can. Our body kind of prefers not to if it doesn't have to, because usually we need to use those to build more proteins. But it does use some for energy all the time, depending on what your diet looks like. So proteins first are broken down into amino acids. Then those amino acids are broken down further into keto acids, and those can be fed in either to glycolysis or at several places in the citric acid cycle. It's hard to nail down just one because there are 20 different amino acids that make up proteins. They're all pretty variable, and so sometimes you're going to plug in a 3-carbon molecule, sometimes 6, sometimes 2. So it kind of depends. So proteins are broken down into amino acids. We see most of them here, but there are 20 of them, and they're a little complicated. So first we have to deaminate them. Every one of them has an amino group, and so that forms ammonia, which we need to get rid of. We combine it with carbon dioxide to produce something called urea, which our kidneys filter out. Otherwise, that could be fairly toxic to us. The rest of it, all the carbon bits, we can feed into various places. So those can be fed into pyruvate at kind of the end of glycolysis, or at a lot of different points along the citric acid cycle. So depending on which amino acid you have, it can enter this cycle at various points, but they still are able to produce ATP. Now, while we haven't memorized every single intermediate molecule along the way with any of these, you saw them. You know that they're there. There's this big, just stew pot of different chemicals available in the mitochondria in the citric acid cycle, and even in the cytoplasm with glycolysis. It may not have occurred to you that these are also chemical factories. And so while the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell, they're also a chemical factory of the cell as well, because each of the intermediate molecules along the way here in the citric acid cycle can also be spit out and used to make other molecules. Let's take a brief look at that here. Here's a somewhat briefer view of the citric acid cycle, and we can see, let me start over here, that with this 5-carbon molecule we can make the amino acid glutamate, which can also be turned into other amino acids or nucleotides as well. Down here we even have the heme group, which helps us make hemoglobin. Up here, this 4-carbon molecule makes another amino acid and also some nucleotides. Then also very importantly, the 6-carbon molecule can be used to make a variety of lipids. So definitely a chemical factory, the mitochondria. Well, that's the rest of the story on ATP production. We can use all kinds of different foods to power our daily operations. Which type really depends a lot on what we eat, what sort of conditions we're subjecting our body to, and our general physical condition as well. In general, it's going to vary quite a bit, but I would say that our body tends to prefer carbohydrates first, then lipids, then proteins as an energy source, but that does vary a bit cell to cell and maybe even person to person. Well, that's it. Keep enjoying life, especially the food part.